the night they dragged her suitcase down 3 flights of stairs, Eleanor Ashford was 7 months pregnant, barefoot, and too exhausted to argue. She stood in the middle of the marble hallway with one hand pressed to the small of her back and the other wrapped around the curved swell of her stomach, watching as her mother-in-law's housekeeper avoided her eyes and set the last bag beside the narrow servants' staircase. At the top of the landing, crystal chandeliers glowed over polished floors and oil paintings and the kind of wealth that liked to call itself tradition. At the bottom of the stairs, behind a swinging door near the kitchens, waited a windowless room with a single iron bed, faded wallpaper, and a ceiling so low it seemed designed to teach humility. Just for a few nights, her husband had said. But he wouldn't look at her when he said it. His mother had, his sister had, and the smile on both their faces had told Eleanor exactly what this was. Not inconvenience, not temporary arrangements, punishment. Consider it appropriate. Celeste Ashford said, fingers glittering with diamonds as she adjusted the silk shawl on her shoulders. Until you remember the difference between where you came from and what you married into. Eleanor might have answered, might have told her that cruelty delivered in a soft voice was still cruelty. But just then the baby shifted hard beneath her ribs, and a sharp pain caught her breath halfway. She gripped the banister until the wave passed. No one moved to help her, no one except the oldest maid in the house, Mrs. Whitmore, who took one involuntary step forward before Celeste's cold glance froze her in place. Julian Ashford, her husband, the man who had once sworn he would spend his life protecting her from every storm, stood beside his mother in a tailored black suit, jaw tense, pride intact. Silence chosen. That silence was worse than the room, worse than the insult, worse than the insult, worse than the humiliation of being displaced in the home where she had been told she was family. Because in that silence, Eleanor heard the truth she had been trying not to hear for months. He had not only let this happen, he believed she deserved it. And if you had seen her in that moment, standing alone under all that gold and crystal with her wedding ring still on her finger and tears burning in her eyes that she refused to let fall, you might have mistaken her for a woman finally broken. But what the Ashfords did not know, what Julian did not know, what his elegant, merciless mother did not know, what his venomous sister did not know, was that the woman they had just sent to sleep in the servants' quarters was not the helpless, nameless girl they thought they had plucked from obscurity. The woman they humiliated carried an old title in her blood, an inheritance older than their fortune, a history none of them had bothered to ask about. And before this was over, the house they used to shame her would tremble under the weight of the truth. Because Eleanor Ashford, the pregnant wife they treated like a servant, was a countess. And by the time Julian learned what he had destroyed, it would already be too late. Eleanor had never wanted to be known for what she inherited. That, more than anything, was what would have sounded absurd to the Ashfords, because people like them believed everyone wanted status. Everyone wanted old money, old names, old power. They believed titles were bait and that anyone born near privilege would spend a lifetime trying to weaponize it. But Eleanor had spent most of her adult life doing the opposite, before she became Eleanor Ashford, before she moved into a world where every smile was measured and every invitation concealed a hierarchy. She had been Eleanor Vale, quiet, observant, graceful without effort. She worked at a museum archive under her mother's surname, in a brick building with bad heating and dust-rich corridors, cataloging letters and estate records from families who had once ruled counties and gone broke, preserving their surnames. She loved faded paper, forgotten stories, and work that asked nothing from her but care. No one there knew she was Countess Eleanor Beaumont of Rosemere because she never used the title. The few legal documents that required it stayed with her solicitors. The rest of the world got the simpler version of her. She had learned early that titles invited 3 kinds of people: flatterers, opportunists, and predators. After her father died, she had watched men speak over her in oak-paneled rooms as if grief had made her invisible and youth had made her stupid. She had watched distant relatives grow warm with concern only when wills were discussed. She had watched society women assess her the way jewelers studied uncut stones calculating polish, value, and resale, so she stepped away. She kept Rosemere, the old county estate, left in trust, but placed its management in professional hands. She funded preservation projects quietly. She lived in a modest townhouse in the city. She drove herself. She wore no family crest, signed no letters with a title. and never corrected strangers who assumed she was ordinary. It had felt for the first time in her life like breathing without a corset. Then she met Julian. It was raining the first day. She saw him, the kind of silver rain that turned the city reflective and blurred the windows of cafes into watercolor. Eleanor had ducked into a corner coffee shop near the museum, balancing a cardboard folder of 17th century estate maps under her coat to keep them dry. There had been only one open seat, and a man in a navy overcoat had looked up from his phone and said, "Take it before someone else does," as if issuing orders was his native language. He was handsome in the polished magazine cover way some men are handsome. Dark hair, sharp jaw, expensive watch, a kind of effortless confidence that could either charm a room or poison it, depending on the soul inside it. That day, it charmed her, not because he was rich, he could recognize money, the way one recognizes a familiar accent, but because, when she sat, he noticed the rain on her sleeves and slid a stack of napkins across the table without ceremony. Because he asked about the old maps peeking from her folder and seemed genuinely interested when she told him what she did. Because for 2 hours he spoke to her not like an heiress or a title or a strategy, but like a woman whose mind he found fascinating. At least that was how it felt. He told her his name was Julian Ashford, and laughed when she admitted she knew the Ashford name mostly from hotels and a family foundation. Gallagher Museum once received an invitation too, but could not afford the table ticket for. He said he hated those Gallagher's. Said wealth made people perform versions of themselves even they could not stand. Said he envied ordinary people their freedom. It was a beautiful lie, though she would not know that for a long time. They kept meeting, at first by accident, then by design. He brought her coffee. She showed him hidden corners of the museum storage rooms where neglected portraits leaned against walls like ghosted ancestors. He listened when she spoke about restoration, grants, and heritage law. He told her about business deals, hostile board members, and growing up in a house so immaculate it had never once felt like home. "I don't want someone impressed by the Ashford name," he said one evening as they walked by the river under a sky streaked to lavender and gold. "I want someone who would still see me if I had nothing." That sentence settled into her heart with dangerous ease. Because that was what she wanted to dot someone who loved her without the Beaumont title, without the land, without the old family weight attached to her. So when the moment came weeks later, candles flickering in her townhouse, Julian tracing the rim of a wine glass, and asking quiet questions about her family, she told him only the parts that sounded harmless. She said her father had managed rural properties. She said her family had old roots in Rosemere County. She said there had been responsibilities after his death and that she preferred not to talk about it much. All true, but trimmed of the truth's sharpest edges, he accepted that version of her with no protests, and she mistook his acceptance for sincerity. What Eleanor did not see then, what now seemed obvious in retrospect, was how carefully Julian had fallen in love with the idea of a woman who appeared gentle, intelligent, and unconnected enough to admire him without threatening him. He liked that she was poised, but not socially competitive. Cultured, but not flashy. Beautiful without seeming to know her own value. In his world, women were often strategic, and Julian fancied himself weary of strategy. Eleanor seemed safe. He proposed 11 months after they met. In the conservatory of a country hotel one of his companies owned. White roses. Winter rain tapping against glass. A ring that would have looked vulgar on most hands and looked restrained on hers. He told her he had never trusted anyone the way he trusted her. Told her she felt like peace. Told her he wanted a marriage without games, without manipulation, without all the poison he had grown up around. She believed him, perhaps because she wanted to. Their wedding was elegant and private. A compromise between Julian's family, demand for prestige, and Eleanor's desire for intimacy. Celeste Ashford wore pearl grey and appraised everything from the flowers to Eleanor's surname with detached disappointment. Julian's younger sister Vanessa smiled the smile of a woman already collecting future insults. The ceremony was held in a chapel on a hill overlooking winter fields. And when Eleanor walked toward Julian, she saw only his face. Not his mother's contempt. Not his sister's calculation. Only the man who took her hand and whispered, "It's us now. Nothing touches us." For a while, it almost felt true. The first months of marriage were bright enough to excuse the shadows. Julian bought them an apartment in the city, though he spent half his time trying to persuade her to move into the Ashford estate full-time. Eleanor resisted gently. She said she preferred space, quiet, distance from social obligations. Julian teased her for being shy and kissed her forehead and let the matter go. At dinners with his family, Celeste made comments, wrapped in etiquette. How lovely that Julian has developed such appreciation for simplicity. I suppose intelligence can make up for breeding in certain circles. You do carry yourself well for someone without formal society training. Vanessa was worse because she was younger and crueler and had no interest in disguise. She still pronounces that word like a scholarship student. Do we know her people at all? It must be refreshing for Julian to marry someone so grateful. Julian usually laughed it off. She's joking, Eleanor. Mother doesn't mean anything by it. You know how they are. That sentence became a brick in the wall between them. You know how they are, as if cruelty were weather and his only option was to comment on it. As if the wound was hers for feeling, not theirs for inflicting. Still, Eleanor endured. She had spent enough of her life in rooms full of brittle privilege to know that some people tested you to see whether you would flinch. She refused to give them the satisfaction. She remained polite, helpful, gracious even when grace cost her, and Julian rewarded that restraint in the beginning. When they were alone, he soothed Ted. He rested his head in her lap after long days and said she made him better. He told her he admired her steadiness. Said she was unlike anyone he had ever known. The first serious fracture came with money, not because Eleanor lacked it, but because Julian assumed she did. They were discussing a restoration charity one evening, and Eleanor casually mentioned she wanted to fund a decaying chapel roof in Rosemere County. Julian asked how much. She told him, and he stared. That's not a donation, that's an acquisition. It needs structural work, she said. If it collapses, the frescoes go with it. And you can just write that kind of check. She realized too late that she had spoken too freely. I have some family funds. How much family funds? Air changed, not visibly, not all at once, but she felt it, the way animals feel a storm before thunder. So she smiled and deflected, saying only that her father had left investments and property holdings. Julian's expression turned unreadable. He did not press her then. He began pressing later. He wanted access to accounts for transparency. He asked more detailed questions about trusts, land, and inheritance law under the guise of helping her manage things intelligently. He suggested merging some of her liquid assets into joint ventures his advisors considered promising. He spoke as if expertise were generosity, as if resistance were childishness. Eleanor, who had spent years being underestimated by men in tailored suits, recognized the maneuvering almost immediately. She said no, with velvet in her voice. Her financial affairs would remain separate. She had legal arrangements already in place. She preferred caution. Julian smiled, but something in him cooled. From then on, the Ashford family's contempt took on a new flavor. Before, they had treated her as beneath them. Now, they treated her as useful, but disobedient. Celeste invited her to luncheons, where conversations became orders. Vanessa asked leading questions about Eleanor's little family properties. Julian, who had once admired her privacy, began interpreting it as disloyalty. If we're husband and wife, why do you act like I'm an outsider? I don't, she said one night, too tired to argue and too honest to lie. I act like a woman who has learned that not every person asking about money deserves an answer. He went still. You think I married you for money? The terrible part was that by then, she no longer knew. I think, she said carefully, that sometimes people reveal themselves slowly. He slept in the guest room that night. 2 weeks later, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. For one miraculous weekend, all the damage seemed reversible. Julian cried when she told him. Genuine tears, unguarded and boyish, sliding down the face of the man who had been taught never to crack in public. He dropped to his knees with both hands on her stomach as if reverence could erase history. He laughed and kissed her and kept repeating, we're having a baby, we're really having a baby. He became attentive, protective, almost tender in the old way. He came to appointments, brought her ginger tea when morning sickness left. Her hook wide pressed his lips to her shoulder when she woke from bad dreams. For a while, Eleanor let hope back in, though only in cautious amounts. Perhaps fatherhood would save him, she thought. Perhaps love would mature him, where marriage had not, but pregnancy did not soften the it sharpened them. Celeste began speaking of the baby as if it were a family asset already enrolled in some private dynasty. Vanessa inspected nursery design samples and complained when Eleanor wanted calm colors instead of gilded excess. Julian started insisting they spend more time at Blackthorn Hall, the Ashford ancestral estate outside the city, because our child should be born into family, not isolation. Eleanor resisted until her doctor recommended reduced travel stress and more rest in her third trimester. Julian seized on that and argued Blackthorn Hall had staff, security, and fresh air. Eleanor's own townhouse was too quiet, too far from proper care. He wore concern like a perfectly tailored coat. She agreed because she was tired. Pregnancy had humbled her body in ways pride could not help. Her back ached. Sleep came in scraps. Some mornings she woke ravenous, some unable to keep water down. She longed not for grand comfort but for steadiness. And though she did not trust Celeste or Vanessa, she still half trusted the man she had married. Blackthorn Hall was magnificent from a distance. A stone house sprawling over hills like inherited certainty, surrounded by clipped hedges, iron gates, and wood so old they looked judicial. The kind of place magazines called timeless and servants called exhausting. Inside, it was colder than any photograph could capture. Not in temp. The corridors drafted bed and atmosphere. Every room seemed arranged for observation. Every chair sat too straight. Every silver frame displayed ancestors with narrow mouths and formal resentment. On Eleanor's first night there, Celeste embraced her lightly and said, "We'll have you comfortable in no time." Vanessa added, "As comfortable as someone with your habits can be in a formal house." Julian squeezed Eleanor's shoulder and told her not to take the bait. That became his second favorite sentence. The first weeks were manageable, because Eleanor kept largely to herself. She read in the morning room, walked slowly in the rose garden with Mrs. Whitmore, wrote letters she never sent. She spoke to the baby when she was alone, palms spread over her stomach, telling the little life inside her about kindness and books, and the smell of rain in the city. She promised things she was no longer sure she could guarantee. Then the campaign began. Small humiliations at first, her preferred meals accidentally forgotten by the kitchen, her prenatal vitamins moved, from bathroom cabinet to drawer to cabinet again, as if hands kept testing whether she noticed. Visitors informed of her fragile nerves, conversations that stopped when she entered, a christening consultant invited without her knowledge. Julian was frequently away on business, and whenever Eleanor complained, he sounded harried. Mother is trying. Vanessa is immature. You're reading too much into it. When Eleanor said she felt isolated, he responded with offense. I brought you here to be cared for. When she said care without respect was control, he ended the call. The first truly public humiliation happened at dinner in front of 12 guests. It was a charity planning evening, one of Celeste's social ritual performances disguised as benevolence. Eleanor had not wanted to attend. Her feet were swollen, her lower back throbbed, and the baby had been unusually restless all day. But Celeste insisted her absence would look ungracious, and Julian fretfully returned, and to invest it in appearances, told her one evening downstairs would not kill her. The dining room glittered under candlelight. The guests were all old money, or those who wanted to sit near it. Eleanor wore a dark blue dress loose enough to accommodate her pregnancy and simple enough that Celeste had looked at it and sighed as if witnessing civic decline. For the first half hour, Eleanor managed, greeted, answered questions, smiled, and endured the covert inspection of women measuring whether pregnancy had made her softer, heavier, weaker. Then one of the older men at the far end asked how her family was enjoying their new connection. To the Ashford name, the table quieted in that specific predatory way privileged tables do when someone senses blood. Eleanor lifted her water glass. My family values privacy. Vanessa gave a little laugh. And that's a gracious way to say there's no one socially relevant enough to mention. A few guests smiled into their wine. Eleanor set the glass down very carefully. No, everyone introduces themselves through rank. Vanessa tilted her head. No, some marry it. Julian should have stopped it then. He should have said enough. Instead, perhaps because he had been drinking, perhaps because pride had been irritated by too many months of Eleanor's boundaries, perhaps because men raised in certain houses learn to perform cruelty when their authority feels uncertain. He leaned back in his chair and said with lazy amusement, Vanessa, be kind. Eleanor still thinks pedigree is something one earns by reading about it in archives. Laughter rippled down the table. Not roaring laughter. That would have been honest. This was worse. The careful, social laughter of people relieved not to be the one being humiliated. Eleanor looked at Julian Dart. Just looked at him. And in that moment something essential inside her stopped reaching for him. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. She rose with all the composure she could gather, ignoring the weight of her body and the ache in her hips, and said, "If the entertainment is over, I'm tired." Celeste's mouth tightened. "Sit down. Leaving the table like that is rude." Eleanor placed one hand on her stomach and answered without raising her voice. "So is offering your wife to a room full of strangers as a joke." Then she left. Julian came to her room later, angry, not ashamed. "You embarrassed me." She laughed once because the alternative was to break. "That is almost magnificent. You're over and save you turned me into a punchline." "Oh, for God's sake." "Eleanor, it was one joke." She faced him fully then, one palm braced against the dresser because the baby had gone strangely still. "No, it was the truth. It was the truth of what you think when your mother is in the room and your spine disappears. It was the truth of what you are when approval matters more to you than decency." His face hardened. "You think you're better than us because you keep secrets. Because you sit there all quiet and superior while we're supposed to pretend not to notice that you've never really let us in." "I never let you own me," she said. "There's a difference." He stared at her for a long time, breathing hard through his nose. Then he said, "Maybe Mother was right. Maybe you like acting persecuted because it makes you feel important." That night, after he slammed the door, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and held herself together with both hands. She did not sleep. She listened to the house breathe and settle around her while dawn slowly silvered the curtains. The next morning, Julian left for London before she woke. No note, no apology, only silence. A week later, Celeste moved the final pieces into place. It happened under the pretense of hosting a foreign donor, an aristocratic widow from Belgium whose title mattered enough to make Celeste feverishly obedient to etiquette. The guest suite Eleanor occupied on the second floor, though not the grandest, was apparently the most suitable for a woman of such importance. Celeste informed Eleanor of this over breakfast with the smile of someone announcing a promotion. "I'm sure you won't mind relocating for a short while. Mrs. Whitmore has prepared a smaller room." "A smaller room where?" Eleanor asked, though the sudden tension in the servant's posture already told her. Celeste buttered her toast. "Near the old staff wing." Julian was present. He was reading financial reports, or pretending to. Eleanor looked at him. "Julian." He did not look up immediately. "It's only temporary. I'm in my third trimester. It's still within the house." Vanessa stirred cream into her coffee and said brightly, "Some women never lose their peasant adaptability." That was when Eleanor understood this had been planned. Asterisk, not a practical rearrangement. SPECT, demotion. And when she refused quietly, firmly, refusing the room and saying she would return to the city, instead Julian's expression darkened, in a way she had rarely seen. "You are not leaving in this condition. I am absolutely leaving in this condition if the alternative is being stored downstairs. Don't be dramatic." A hand trembled on the edge of the table. "You're asking your pregnant wife to sleep in a servant's room so your mother can impress a donor." His jaw flexed. "I am asking you to cooperate for 1 week." Celeste dabbed her lips. A lady would understand household priorities, and Eleanor, exhausted and sore, and already half dizzy from the strain of fighting in a place where every corridor seemed built to amplify power, said the one thing that detonated the room. A real lady would never ask this. The silence that followed was absolute. Celeste's eyes turned glacial. Julian stood dot, and by evening, Eleanor's bags were downstairs. That was the night at the beginning of this story. The night Julian chose silence, the night his mother called degradation appropriate, the night his pregnant wife was sent to the servants' quarters while the house looked on. The room itself smelled faintly of starch and old wood, a tiny sink. In the corner, one narrow wardrobe, an iron bed with a mattress thin enough to make every spring a fact. The only window faced a brick wall just feet away, letting in light but not sky. Mrs. Whitmore brought extra blankets and hot milk and cried when Eleanor pretended not to notice. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the older woman whispered, voice shaking. "There are some things in this house decent people cannot stop." Eleanor touched her hand. "Thank you for trying." When the door closed, Eleanor finally let herself crumble. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a slow folding inward, like paper soaked too long in rain. She sat on the bed, then slid to the floor because it felt more solid, back pressed to the frame, arms around herself as much as around the child inside her. Humiliation is a strange kind of pain. It burns in places no one can bandage. It makes memory venomous. It turns every earlier kindness suspicious, In that narrow room, Eleanor replayed her marriage, the way one re-examines a portrait after learning the subject was lying. Julian's tenderness, Julian's promises, Julian's offense whenever she kept part of herself protected, Julian's hunger around discussions of inheritance, Julian's need, more than love, to be central dot and beneath all that, the quiet devastation. She had trusted him with her unguarded self, not the countess, not the heiress, just Eleanor, and he had still found a way to make her feel Purchasable. The baby kicked then, sudden and strong, and Eleanor pressed both hands to her stomach, as tears finally spilled. "I know," she whispered, "I know." At some point after midnight, she made two decisions. The first was that she would not raise her child in any house where dignity was conditional. The second was that she was done protecting people who had mistaken her grace for powerlessness. The next morning she called the only person outside her legal team who knew her full history. His name was Benedict Harrow, and he had been her father's closest friend, solicitor, and the nearest thing Eleanor had to an uncle. Benedict had silver hair, courtroom manners, and a loyalty so complete it was almost old-fashioned. He answered on the second ring. Ellie. No one called her that anymore. The sound of it nearly undid her. "I need you," she said. There was no preamble after that. No demand for explanation before compassion. Only the calm, efficient focus of a man who had spent decades navigating crises for families too proud to call them that. "Are you in danger?" "I'm not sure yet." "That means yes enough for me." "Tell me where you are." When he heard Blackthorn Hall, there was a brief silence. Then, very quietly, "Has Julian Ashford any idea who his wife is?" "No." "Does his mother?" "No." "Good," Benedict said, and something in his tone made Eleanor sit straighter despite the ache in her body. "Keep it that way for a little longer." He arranged for a private physician to review her care within 48 hours. He instructed one of Rosemere's senior estate security officers, ostensibly retired, to stay nearby under civilian cover. He told Eleanor not to sign anything, agree to anything, or travel alone. Most importantly, he said he was coming. "What if they ask who you are?" Eleanor stared at the brick beyond the window. "Tell them the truth, if you like." "They won't believe it." But that same day, the Belgian donor arrived. Her name was Baroness Lucille Devereux, and Celeste received her like royalty. Staff lined the entrance hall. Fresh arrangements of white lilies appeared in every room. Vanessa wore green silk and an expression of career ambition. Julian returned from the city early to charm the guest, and Eleanor, after being advised it would be best if she rested out of sight, remained downstairs in the servants' quarters while laughter floated above her through old floorboards. If this had been the end of the indignity, perhaps the marriage might have staggered on a little longer, but cruelty rarely stops at the point of sufficiency. Once people discover you will endure humiliation without public explosion, they often grow bolder. Vanessa came to the servants' room that evening with a glass of sparkling water she did not offer and a smile sharpened to a point. "You should be grateful," she said, taking in the room. "Most women in your position would have been sent away entirely." "My position?" She leaned against the doorframe. A woman with uncertain breeding, concealed finances, and a husband beginning to notice both. Eleanor was too tired to perform civility. "If you came here for a reaction, I'm afraid you've overestimated your importance." Vanessa's smile thinned. "Do you know what Julian said after the dinner last week? He said you've become impossible since the pregnancy. Paranoid, secretive, emotional. Men start to wonder. You know, when a woman gets that defensive." Eleanor lifted her gaze slowly. "Wonder what?" Vanessa let the silence stretch. "Well, she's hiding more than bank statements." For one split second, the meaning did not land, then it did. The baby.paternity. A coldness, deeper than fear, spread through Eleanor's chest. "You are filth," she said softly. Vanessa shrugged as if discussing whether pregnancy creates complications. "Families need certainty." She left before Eleanor could answer, leaving the door ajar like an insult. When Julian came downstairs later, summoned by a message Eleanor sent with shaking hands, he found his wife, standing in the corridor with one palm braced against the wall and fury making her almost luminous. "Did you allow your sister to suggest this child is not yours?" He actually hesitated, just for a heartbeat, but that heartbeat was enough. Eleanor went white. "Answer me." Julian exhaled hard. Vanessa runs her mouth. "That wasn't my question." "No," he snapped. Then lower. "No, I did not tell her to say that." but you've thought it. His silence was answer enough again. It is possible for a person to feel a marriage die inside them, not explode, not shatter, die quietly, with a final exhale. Eleanor felt it then. Not because the accusation itself made sense, it did not. Not in any world governed by facts, but because suspicion where love should have been meant, the foundation had been rotten long before the crack showed. She took off her wedding ring and placed it in his palm. Julian stared. Don't be absurd. I would rather sleep on stone alone than beside a man who can look at his pregnant wife and let that thought live in him. You're overreacting. No, she said, voice suddenly calm in a way that frightened him. I'm waking up. She turned to go back into the room, but a searing pain tore through her abdomen so sharply that her knees buckled. Julian lunged and caught her before she hit the floor. Another pain came, lower and stronger. His face strained. Eleanor. She gripped his sleeve so hard her nails dug through fabric. Get a doctor. Chaos followed. Staff running. Celeste demanding information. Vanessa appearing pale for the first time in her adult life. Julian carrying Eleanor upstairs, despite her whispered "don't touch me" because urgency had stripped him to instinct. The local physician arrived first and frowned after the initial examination. Benedict's physician, who had already been on alert, arrived within the hour with equipment and quiet authority. The diagnosis was not labor, though it could have become that if the stress continued. Severe uterine irritability, dangerous elevated blood pressure, mandatory bed rests, no emotional agitation, no travel until stabilized unless under specialist supervision. The doctor asked for calm surroundings. Benedict arrived the next morning. The Ashfords expected a provincial family solicitor with a worn briefcase and deferential tone. They were disappointed. Benedict Harrow walked into Blackthorn Hall in a charcoal suit that fit like judgment and introduced himself with a kind of effortless authority that made even old money households listen. He requested a private meeting with Eleanor first, not as requested, in the way powerful men phrase decisions. When Julian entered Eleanor's room half an hour later, Benedict was seated beside her bed reviewing documents. Eleanor looked pale but composed, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder, one hand resting over her stomach. There was no ring on her finger. Benedict rose. Mr. Ashford? Julian nodded stiffly. You're Eleanor's solicitor. One of them, Celeste, standing just behind Julian, smiled her public smile. How reassuring that she keeps such formidable legal company. Benedict returned the smile without warmth. Lady Eleanor inspires caution in those who care for her. Room went still. Vanessa, just entering, let out a little laugh. Lady Eleanor. Julian frowned. What did you say? Benedict adjusted his cuff. I said Lady Eleanor. Celeste's eyes narrowed. Surely there is some misunderstanding. There is, Benedict said. Several, in fact. The most pressing being that this household appears not to understand who Mrs. Ashford is. Julian glanced at Eleanor, who met his gaze with unbearable steadiness. What is he talking about? She should have enjoyed the moment more than she did. She should have taken satisfaction in the sudden fissure in his certainty, the way posture changed as instincts sensed rank where contempt had assumed lack, but exhaustion and grief made triumph thin. She only said, the truth you never cared enough to ask for. Benedict, perhaps sensing she no longer had energy for revelation, took over. Before marriage, your wife was and remains Countess Eleanor Beaumont of Rosemere, sole titled heir of the Beaumont line, beneficiary of the Rosemere Trust, controlling principal of Beaumont Heritage Holdings, and patron of several restoration and land stewardship initiatives whose annual expenditures exceed some regional corporate portfolios. No one spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter. Vanessa laughed again, but it came out brittle. That's absurd. Benedict reached into his case and withdrew copies of formal documents. Letters, patent, trust instruments, and a financial summary. So understated it looked almost modest until one understood the numbers. Julian did not take them at first. Celeste did. Her hands, immaculate and bejeweled, betrayed her before her face did. A small tremor, a pause too long. Ice scanning seals older than the Ashford brand. Signatures from officers no social fraud could fabricate. No, Julian said at last, staring at Eleanor as if the shape of her face had changed. Why wouldn't you tell me? She looked at him for a long moment. So I would know whether you loved me. He recoiled as if struck. Celeste's composure returned with almost supernatural speed. She set the documents down and moved to Eleanor's bedside with her most gracious tone. If only we had known. Eleanor turned her face away. Celeste more than any speech. Benedict stepped between them with polite finality. Lady Eleanor requires rest. Given her current medical condition, I must insist all stressful interactions cease immediately. In addition, until appropriate arrangements are made, no member of this household is to approach her without consent. Julian's voice had gone rough. My wife is not your client to remove from me. Benedict's expression barely changed. She is both my client and, at present, a medically vulnerable woman whose husband permitted her to be relocated to serve in accommodations while in a high-risk pregnancy. The words landed like stones. Julian flushed. Celeste's spine stiffened. Vanessa, who had never in her life been publicly corrected by a man of equal social weight, looked ready to spit venom but smart enough to wait. Eleanor closed her eyes. Because the room had begun to swim, the Countess' revelation traveled through Blackthorn Hall faster than smoke. Staff whispered in corridors. Footmen stood a little straighter when she passed. Maids, who had pitied her, now looked almost reverent. Mrs. Whitmore cried openly and apologized for every slight the household had forced others to deliver. Even Baroness Devereux, upon hearing, requested a private audience and emerged an hour later visibly charmed. Later informing Celeste over tea that Lady Eleanor had the true mark of Breeden-Chewer's rank lightly. That sentence was a knife. Celeste heard in it not praise but comparison. Because Celeste Ashford, for all her cultivated superiority, had spent decades buying proximity to forms of aristocracy she could never organically inherit. The Ashfords were massively wealthy, yes, but knew enough in the old circles to still crave validation. And now the daughter-in-law she had treated like dirt turned out to possess exactly the lineage. Celeste worshipped the humiliation would have been almost comic if Eleanor had not been living inside its aftermath. Julian, meanwhile, unraveled. At first his reaction was disbelief laced with injury. He came to her room that evening, after Benedict reluctantly allowed a supervised visit, looking like a man who had walked all day in a storm. His pride was still there, but it had cracks now. Real ones. You lied to me. Eleanor, propped against pillars too drained for fury, answered flatly. I omitted a title. You let me think I let you think I was a woman worth loving without one. His mouth tightened. That's not fair, She almost smiled. You let your family treat me like a stain on your carpet. I didn't know exactly. Moved closer, anguish finally breaking through the control he wore like skin. If I had known who you were, that was when she looked at him with such cold clarity that he stopped. If you had known, she said softly, you would have behaved better, and that is the entire problem. The silence after that was unbearable. Julian saw it too. Finally, not merely her anger, but the indictment underneath. The fact that every kindness he now felt compelled to offer stood contaminated by motive. Was it remorse, love, or sudden awareness of what he had endangered by misjudging her? He knelt beside the bed the way he had when she told him about the baby. But this time the gesture looked stripped of innocence. Ellie, don't. He swallowed. I love you. No, she said, and her voice did not rise. You loved being chosen by someone who seemed gentle enough to admire you and vague enough not to threaten you. Then you resented the parts of me you couldn't inspect. Then you distrusted the parts you couldn't control. That isn't love. It's appetite dressed up in vows. He closed his eyes like a man absorbing a blade. Please, he whispered. Tell me what to do. She turned her face toward the window. Leave. He did. But remorse, once awakened in weak men, often becomes frantic rather than noble. Julian started trying to repair everything at once. He confronted Vanessa. He argued with Celeste behind closed doors so loudly that servants froze in hallways. He ordered Eleanor's room restored exactly as it had been. Had the servants' quarters redecorated in outrage after the fact as if furniture could cancel degradation. Arranged private specialists, flowers, gifts, handwritten notes. Eleanor accepted medical care and rejected everything else. She did not read the notes. She did not read the notes. She sent the flowers to the chapel. She wore no jewelry he bought. Celeste shifted tactics too. Where before there had been contempt, now there was strategic warmth. My dear Eleanor, misunderstandings happen in every family. Perhaps we should host a small dinner in your honor. I do hope you won't let temporary tensions create permanent distance. The ugliness of it was almost impressive. An entire personality reorganized around access to Vanessa. however, could not adapt. Her contempt had been too honest to reverse gracefully. She became nastier in subtler ways, muttering that titles were merely costumes for women who knew how to deceive, implying Eleanor had entrapped Julianne by withholding status. Calling her dramatic for invoking medical fragility, the house reached breaking point 5 days later at brunch. Asterisks. Eleanor had been cleared to come downstairs for brief periods. If calm was maintained, Benedict was in the library taking a call. Julian had insisted he could manage one family meal peacefully. Eleanor agreed only because she was tired of being confined and wanted to see whether Julian possessed. Even now, 1 inch of spine under, pressure for 10 minutes, it was civil. Then Baroness Devereux, still a guest, complimented Eleanor's family seat at Rosemere, saying she had once attended a summer recital there in her youth and found it far superior in grace to so many houses funded but never cultured. Celeste nearly choked on tea. Vanessa said, "Well, money does buy lovely restoration." Baroness Devereux replied coolly, "Only if guided by taste. That cannot be purchased." Julian stared at his plate. Eleanor should have let the moment pass. She was tired, the baby heavy, her blood pressure still monitored, but something in Julian's silence had gotten silence. Always silence append an older wound. She set down her cup. "Is there a reason?" she asked, looking directly at her husband, "that every woman in this house speaks with more courage than you?" The roof froze. Julian lifted his gaze. Shame flared, then defensiveness. "I have tried to make things right. You have tried to smooth appearances." "That's not true, then say it." His jaw tightened. "Say what?" She held his eyes. "Say that what they did to me was vile. Say that you allowed it because pleasing them has always mattered more to you than protecting your wife. Say that your pride was so fragile you preferred to suspect me, rather than confront your own family." Celeste cut in sharply. "This is inappropriate." Eleanor did not look at her. "And you," she said to Julian, "say that if I had truly been who you thought I was, ordinary, untitled, without land, without trust, without old paper to prove I mattered, you still should have defended me, not because I turned out to be a countess, because I was your wife." Julian went pale. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And in that silence, Baroness Devereux slowly set down her napkin and looked at him with a disgust only an old aristocrat can deliver without raising her voice. "My dear boy," she said, "I believe your wife has just explained the difference between breeding and performance." That afternoon the Baroness cut short her stay. She made it publicly known. She was reconsidering a charitable partnership with Celeste's foundation due to unfortunate household values. Society heard. Society always hears. Invitations softened calls when unanswered. A small but meaningful social frost began. Celeste blamed Eleanor. Julian blamed himself. Vanessa blamed everyone. And then the real twist arrived. It came in the form of a man neither Julian nor Celeste expected to see at Blackthorn Hall. Nathan Mercer, Chief Financial Officer of Ashford Hospitality Group, a man loyal not to family theatrics but to numbers. He arrived, grim-faced, and requested Julian immediately. Voices rose in the study. Doors shut. Half an hour later Julian emerged, looking as though the floor had dissolved under him. Ashford Hospitality was exposed. Not bankrupt. Not yet, but dangerously over. Several expansion deals Julianne had, champion bold, ego-driven, poorly timed, were underperforming. A key lender had grown skittish. A development bridge depended on confidence and collateral they no longer cleanly possessed. Quietly, discreetly, Julian had expected to stabilize everything through a strategic liquidity event he had not fully disclosed to his board. He had counted on persuading Eleanor eventually to bring part of her holdings into a consortium vehicle. He had never put that in writing. He had never needed to. In his mind, marriage itself had been leveraged. Now Nathan had learned enough to ask questions. Julian could not answer convincingly. Worse, one of Celeste's cherished foundations had, under layers of propriety, become entangled in the image economy of the family business. Not illegal, not yet, but reputationally explosive if donors sensed that Ashfords were using cultural philanthropy as perfume over financial rot. Julian came to Eleanor that night with the dazed look of a man seeing all his earlier choices lit. "From behind, you knew," he said dulled. She was seated by the window with a blanket over her knees. Benedict reviewing some papers nearby. "About what?" The market was turning against our hotel debt structure." Benedict glanced up mildly. "Lady Eleanor is not in the habit of commenting on her husband's business unless invited respectfully." Julian ignored him. At dinner 2 months ago, when I mentioned the coastal acquisition, you asked whether our lenders had stress-tested sovereign risk exposure. You knew. Eleanor met his eyes. I understood you were behaving like an overconfident man in a forgiving suit. His laugh came out ragged. Why didn't you say more? Would you have listened? He had no answer. Because no, he would not have. He had heard her expertise before and translated it into meddling. He had seen intelligence, and treated it as decoration until it contradicted him. Now the same mind he dismissed might have saved him millions. It is a brutal thing to discover that the person you diminished was stronger, wiser, and more loyal than you deserved. But Julian was not done learning. The next blow came from the doctor. Not Eleanor's physician this time, but a specialist Julian had personally requested in a desperate attempt to prove his care. After additional tests, the specialist confirmed that stress-induced complications had worsened more than expected and that Eleanor's recent bleeding, something she had minimized to avoid more drama, suggested a serious risk of premature delivery if she remained in hostile conditions. She needed immediate transfer to a private maternal care residence or secure home environment with strict emotional stability. Benedict, who had already prepared for this, said calmly, Rosemere is ready. Celeste protested that moving Eleanor would look like family division. Benedict looked at her as one might regard a stain. Family division occurred when she was sent to the servants' wing. Julian stepped forward. I'll go with her, Eleanor answered before anyone else. The single syllable silenced the room. Julian stared. I'm the father. You are the source of half the stress. He flinched. I won't keep you for medical updates, she said, voice tired but steady. But you will not come to Rosemere. Not now. You can't just remove my child. Benedict's tone remained even. Legally and medically, given present circumstances, Lady Eleanor's autonomy is not under debate. Julian turned to her, desperation finally stripping away the last layers of arrogance. Please, don't shut me out. Eleanor's eyes filled for the first time in front of him. Not with weakness, but with the grief of a woman mourning the man she had hoped existed. I did not shut you out, Julian, she whispered. I opened the door, and you invited wolves. She left Blackthorn Hall the next morning, not in disgrace, not in secrecy, in daylight, with medical escorts, Benedict at her side, and the household staff lined discreetly near the entrance because even servants know when justice begins to turn. Mrs. Whitmore kissed Eleanor's hand through tears. Several maids curtsied. The chauffeur loaded her belongings, every single one, including the suitcase that had been dragged downstairs like a sentence. Julian stood on the steps. As she was helped into the car, he looked younger somehow, smaller, as if losing her had peeled away the architecture he relied on to appear formidable. Eleanor, she paused with one hand on the doorframe. He swallowed hard. I am sorry. She studied him for a long time. There are apologies that arrive like bombs, arrive like rain after fire. Welcome. Too late. Unable to rebuild what had burned. No, she said. Then she got in the car. Rosemere was everything. Blackthorn Hall was not. Old, yes. Grand in its own way, yes. But warm, lived in, human. Ivy climbed the stone walls without being clipped into submission. The library smelled of leather and cedar and rain. The drawing rooms held furniture people actually sat in. Staff moved with loyalty rather than fear. And outside the south windows, gardens opened into meadows that rolled all the way toward a small silver lake where Eleanor used to walk with her father as a child. When she arrived, exhausted and aching and emotionally flayed raw, the house received her not as a symbol but as its own. For the first 3 days, she slept. For the next 4, she wept in private and smiled in public and tried to learn the new shape of safety. The baby stabilized, her blood pressure began to ease. At twilight she sat under blankets in the orangery, palm over her stomach, and listened to the fountain while thinking about names, about futures, about whether a child could inherit resilience without inheriting damage. Asterisk, asterisk, Julian sent letters every day. Not flowers anymore, not gifts. Letters, some were short, some pages long. Apologies, confessions, attempts, and honesty so late they almost qualified as tragedy. He wrote that he had grown up learning weakness was whatever displeased Celeste, that love in his house had always been conditional on usefulness, though he did love Eleanor, but had loved badly because possession came easier to him than reverence. He wrote that he had confronted Vanessa and moved to remove Celeste from several family foundation positions. He wrote that Ashford hospitality was in crisis, and for the first time in his life, he could not tell whether he feared losing the company or deserved to. Eleanor read every letter. She answered none. And then, one rainy afternoon, the final revelation came. Benedict entered the library where Eleanor was reviewing nursery sketches and closed the door behind him with the expression he reserved for facts. Too sharp to soften, there's something you need to hear before it reaches you. Another way. Her hand stilled on the paper. What now? He sat across from her. Nathan Mercer provided documents through counsel this morning. Julian's paternity suspicion did not begin with Vanessa's malice. It was seeded. By whom? Celeste. Eleanor felt the room narrow. Benedict went on carefully. Several months ago, when Julian first realized your private holdings were substantial but inaccessible, Celeste commissioned inquiries into your past. She found no scandal, no affair, nothing usable. But she did find that your marriage settlement preserved your independent assets and that any divorce initiated under certain fault conditions could complicate public standing and future claims. Eleanor's voice came out barely above a breath, so she wanted fault. Benedict nodded. According to correspondence, she believed if Julian began doubting the child, emotional instability might pressure you into concessions. Perhaps not. Direct transfer? Perhaps settlement? Perhaps merely weakening your negotiating position? For a moment Eleanor could not speak. Outside, rain struck the windows in soft, relentless taps. Did Julian know? At first, no. Later, Benedict's pause told her enough. He did not author it, but he failed to reject it decisively when it served his anger. And that was the final death. Not the humiliation. Not even the suspicion, the knowledge that her pregnancy, her child, the most sacred vulnerability in her life had been dragged into strategy by a family that measured human worth and leverage. Eleanor stood too quickly. Benedict rose, alarmed, but she only crossed to the window and braced both hands on the sill as tears blurred the wet garden beyond. I chose him, she said after a long time. I chose him because I thought he was the one place in the world I wouldn't have to be Countess Beaumont. I thought with him I could just be a woman. Benedict's voice softened. You were. He simply wasn't enough of a man to deserve that trust. Labor began 10 days later under a sky the color of pearl. It started before dawn with a pressure unlike the false pains before. Not chaotic this time. Inevitable. The house woke in stages. Midwives called, doctors summoned, fires laid, towels warmed. Benedict paced and pretended not to. Mrs. Alden, Rosemire's senior housekeeper who had helped deliver half the staff's children over the years, took command of practicalities with battle-tested calm. Eleanor labored for 16 hours. Pain strips language to essentials. In those hours there was no countess, no scandal, no Ashford politics, only breath, effort, fear, and the wild ancient threshold between holding life inside and bringing it into danger and light. She thought of her mother, of her father, of Julian's hand once trembling on her stomach when he first heard the news, of the servants' room, of the vows, of every version of herself that had led to this bed, this storm of the body, this child insisting on arrival. Near the end, when the pain broke her open and she thought she could not go farther, the doctor leaned close and said, "One more. For your daughter." Daughter, the word poured strength into her like fire at sunset, with rain clearing and the first low ember of evening filling the room. Eleanor gave birth to a girl. She was small but healthy, furious at the world in the way healthy babies often are, with a strong cry and dark hair damp against her head, when they laid her on Eleanor's chest. All the rooms inside her that had gone cold these past months flooded with something warm enough to survive anything, my love. Eleanor whispered, tears soaking into the child's blanket. My brave little love. They named her Clara, after Eleanor's mother. Julian learned of the birth from Benedict. He asked to come. Eleanor refused at first. Then, after 2 days of holding Clara and watching the rise and fall of her tiny breathing, after sleep and exhaustion, and the peculiar softening motherhood sometimes brings not to judgment but to certainty, she changed her mind. Not because she wanted reconciliation, because she wanted no future accusation that she had denied. Fatherhood out of vengeance, he arrived at Rosemere in the evening and entered the nursery as if approaching a chapel. Julian had lost weight. There were grey threads now at his temples Eleanor did not remember. He stopped several feet from the chair where she sat with Clara against her shoulder, swaddled in cream wool. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his face crumpled. He covered his mouth with one hand and wept, not the restrained tears of a man trying to remain dignified. True, helpless weeping. The kind pulled from some chamber so deep it humiliates ego on the way out. Eleanor watched in silence. She's beautiful, he whispered. Double quotes, yes. He took one hesitant step closer. May I? Eleanor looked down at Clara, then up at him. She placed the baby in his arms with careful instruction. Julian held his daughter as if the whole architecture of his life might collapse if he shifted too hard. Clara made a tiny protesting noise, then settled, blinking at the world with solemn confusion. Julian laughed through tears. Hello? He whispered to her. Hello, little girl. Eleanor had once believed this sight would mend her. It did not. It moved her. Yes. There was pain in it, and tenderness, and something almost unbearably sad. But healing is not the same as reversal. Some things can be grieved without being restored. Julian looked up eventually, eyes red. I have ruined everything. She answered with the honesty he had spent too long avoiding. Yes. He nodded once, absorbing it. I filed motions, he said quietly, to remove Mother from the foundation boards. Vanessa has been cut off from company governance. I've cooperated with the board review. If there are civil claims you wish to bring, I won't contest them. And I signed the postnatal recognition and custody terms Benedict's team sent over. Eleanor said nothing. He looked back down at Clara. I am not asking you to forgive me now. Maybe not ever. But I am asking for the chance to be better for her than I was for you. There it was. Not romance. Not bargaining. The first truly decent thing he had said in a long time. Eleanor leaned back in her chair and let the silence settle around them. Being better for her, she said at last, will begin with learning that love is not ownership, apologies not repair, and protection that arrives after humiliation is not protection. Julian bowed his head. I know, no, you know the words. Learning them will take years. He accepted that too. Outside Rosemere, the Ashford world was collapsing in elegant stages. The board of Ashford Hospitality, already alarmed by financial exposure, moved swiftly once internal correspondence surfaced, hinting at coercive marital motives. Nothing criminal stuck in the end, but reputational damage did what prosecutors could not. Investors lost confidence. One major project was sold at a loss. Julian was forced to step back from executive control pending restructuring. Society, always moral when scandal becomes expensive, began treating Celeste as a contaminant rather than a queen maker. That the foundations she curated so obsessively withdrew invitations. The women she had patronized for years suddenly became unreachable. Baroness Devereux made one exquisitely destructive remark at a winter dinner. Some households confuse silverware with civility. And the sentence spread through certain circles like perfume with acid in it. Vanessa, denied access to company funds and shunned by enough of her former allies, attempted to sell stories to a tabloid under a fake contact. The paper's legal team, alerted by Benedict before publication, buried the attempt before it hatched. The embarrassment alone was enough to exile her from most of the circles she valued. Celeste, perhaps most wounded by irrelevance, requested a meeting with Eleanor. 3 months after Clara's birth. Benedict advised against it. Eleanor agreed anyway. Not alone, not at Rosemary's heart, but in the west drawing room with witnesses within call and Clara upstairs asleep. Celeste entered dressed impeccably in winter cream, carrying herself with the last rigid remains of a life built on control. She looked older and not softer, simply older, as if status loss had extracted years all at once. For a moment the two women regarded one another across the tea table. Then Celeste said, I owe you an apology. Eleanor almost laughed at the poverty of the sentence compared to the wealth of harm behind it. You owe me many things, she said. Celeste drew in a breath. I misjudged you. No, Eleanor replied. You judged me exactly as you intended. You just happened to be wrong about what could be done to me without consequence. Celeste's nostrils flared. Old habits die hardest in the proud. Asterisk, asterisk, I was protecting my family. From what? A woman with dignity. From uncertainty. From hidden motives. Eleanor leaned forward, and whatever gentleness remained in her did not include mercy for this. You put stress on a pregnant woman to gain advantage. You used my child as leverage in your imagination. You sent me to a servant's room in a house where I was supposed to be safe. Do not ever speak to me of family again unless you first learn the meaning of the word. For the first time, Celeste's eyes filled, not with theatrical tears, with wounded ego meeting truth, too clean to deflect. I loved my son, she said, voice soft and Only in sadness, not in pity. Then you should have taught him courage. Celeste left without touching her tea. That was the last private meeting they ever had. The divorce, when it came, was controlled but not quiet. Eleanor did not seek public vengeance. She sought precision, clear custody terms, asset separation, for legal acknowledgement of her independent holdings, protections for Clara, limited visitation, expanding only with demonstrated consistency, and completed therapeutic compliance. Benedict arranged every clause like a mason laying stone against future weather. Julian signed without contest. The tabloids, of course, still had their feast. They loved the fairy tale cruelty of it. Pregnant wife banished, hidden countess revealed, old money humiliation turned inside out. But Eleanor never fed them. Not one interview, not one public statement. The silence itself became power. It let the world imagine, and imagination often punishes more harshly than testimony. Julian, too. His credit did what few broken men with money and vanity managed to do. He kept showing up after the cameras lost interest. He came for supervised visits, sat on nursery floors and rolled up sleeves, learned how to hold Clara through colic, read board books in a voice too serious for farm animals. He apologized less with language over time and more with consistency. He did therapy, real therapy, not rebranded executive coaching. He stopped asking Eleanor what he could do to win her back and started asking what Clara needed. It was a beginning, not redemption. Beginnings are smaller than that. Years later, perhaps Clara would decide what kind of father he became. That was no longer Eleanor's burden to script. As for Eleanor, she changed in ways even she had not expected, and into ice. Not into vengeance, into clarity. She resumed management of Rosemere more directly, launching maternal housing initiatives through one of the family trusts after quietly funding legal aid for pregnant women facing domestic coercion, expanded preservation programs. But now she spoke publicly when she wished, and with her full title when useful, not because she needed the world impressed, but because she understood something she had once resisted. Power hidden from the cruel does not always protect the vulnerable. Sometimes it protects the cruel she wore. Countess, Beaumont, when necessary. Like armor. She wore Eleanor when possible, like home. And on the first anniversary of Clara's birth, she did something no one expected. She returned to Blackthorn Hall, not to live. Never that, but to attend the final transfer ceremony through which the Ashford family sold the estate's charitable annex and portions of surrounding land to stabilize debts and settle governance disputes. One parcel included the old staff wing and kitchen. Another included the neglected cottage row once used for retired employees. The buyers assumed the lots would become luxury conversions. They were wrong, because the purchasing entity, operating through a discreet heritage and community trust, belonged to Eleanor. When she stepped out of the car that day with Clara in her arms and Benedict beside her, the irony was so sharp it almost shimmered in the winter air. Staff gathered discreetly near the entrance. Some current, some former, all watching. Julian stood on the steps, not as master of the estate anymore, but as a man who understood what symbolism can cost. Celeste was not present. Pride had apparently kept her away. Vanessa had long since vanished abroad. Julian met Eleanor at the threshold. "You bought the West Parcel," he said. "And the staff cottages," she replied. He looked toward the old servants' entrance, where rain-dark stone framed the same narrow staircase down which her bags had once been carried. "What will you do with them?" Eleanor adjusted Clara's blanket. "Restore them. For what?" "For the women your world never noted, until they're useful. Temporary housing, legal support, maternal recovery suites. A place where no pregnant woman will ever again be told her dignity depends on the room she's given." Julian closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was pain there, but also something harder and cleaner. Respect earned too late. "That, just as he said, no," Eleanor answered, looking past him toward the wing where she had once wept on a floor beside an iron bed. "Justice would be undoing it. This is simply what mercy looks like when it refuses to forget." Inside, signatures were completed, transfers executed, staff futures partially secured through terms Eleanor had insisted on. Mrs. Whitmore, retiring that spring, was offered lifelong residency in one of the restored cottages if she wished it. She accepted with tears. Before leaving, Eleanor asked to see the old room one last time. Julian did not follow her. She went alone. It looked smaller than memory, as humiliating places often do once you no longer fear them. The wallpaper had peeled further. The iron bed remained. Light from the little window still struck the brick outside and bounced inward without. Beauty. Eleanor stood in the center of that room with Clara warm against her shoulder and felt not rage now but distance. The kind earned only when pain is no longer your address. This is where they put us, she whispered to her daughter, kissing her soft hair. And this is where we did not break. Then she turned and walked out.
People
Often think stories like this end with grand revenge, with public apologies shouted across ballrooms, with bankrupt empires and satisfying collapses, with villains on their knees and heroes crowned in light. Life is rarely that theatrical. Its justice is stranger and, in some ways, sharper. Julianne did apologize publicly once, though not in the way gossip columns hoped. At a fundraising event 2 years later, one now co-sponsored by Lenore's Maternal Housing Trust, he was asked by a donor why he'd become so committed to family welfare policy after spending much of his career focused solely on luxury development. He answered in a room full of the kind of people who hear one sentence and build 10 articles from it. Because I once failed the woman who deserved my loyalty most. He said, steady and unadorned, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure my daughter learns from my repair, not my failure. It was not spectacle, it was enough. Eleanor heard about it afterward, smiled without triumph, and went upstairs to tuck Clara into bed. By then, Clara was old enough to ask questions. Why Daddy lived in the city. Why Grandma Celeste never visited. Rosemere, why some people in old pictures looked angry when dressed so beautifully. Eleanor answered with exoperate truths. Some grown-ups confuse control with love. Some houses teach people to perform kindness before they learn how to feel it. Your father made terrible choices and works hard now to make better ones. We can love people and still require boundaries. Dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you refuse to surrender. And, Clara, with the solemn attention of children receiving truths that will one day shape them, listen to us for. The titled Countess. Eleanor eventually laughed at how dramatically the world had treated it, as if nobility had saved her. It had not. Not really. Money gave options. Rank forced consequences in circles that worshipped it, but the thing that truly saved her had existed before any title, and would exist after all titles were dust. It was the quiet spine inside her, the part that did not shudder in the servants' room, the part that called for help, the part that chose not to let humiliation become inheritance. That was the real story. Not that they made a countess sleep downstairs, but that they made a woman believe she was powerless. And she proved them wrong without ever becoming cruel enough to resemble them. On certain evenings when the light turned honey gold over Rosemere Lake, Eleanor would walk the gardens with Clara toddling ahead and think of the girl she used to be. The one in the museum archive with dust on her sleeves and hope in her chest. The one who wanted to be loved plainly, without title or strategy or old blood getting in the way. She felt tenderness for that girl. Now not shame, because wanting to be loved simply is not foolish. Entrusting the wrong person with that hope is human, and surviving the betrayal of it, surviving it without losing your capacity for warmth, without teaching your child bitterness as a first language, without letting the people who diminished you determine your shape forever, that is a rarer kind of nobility than anything a crown or document can bestow. So if you ever find yourself in a room meant to reduce you, if people with polished voices and inherited cruelty try to convince you that your worth depends on their approval, remember Eleanor in that low-ceilinged room behind the kitchens. Remember the suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. Remember the husband who stood silent. Remember the mother-in-law who mistook status for superiority. Remember the sister who mistook malice for strength. And then remember this. By the end of the story, the room stayed small. The woman did not.